Cultural narratives promise a final destination, a permanent state of union in perfect stasis. The underlying physics of the system, however, fiercely resists this immobility. When we examine this resistance scientifically, the research typically splinters into highly specialized, isolated silos. Psychologists map the phenomenon as an adaptive behavioral drive aimed at securing attachment and ensuring proximity. Neuroscientists observe transient chemical fluctuations, characterized by spikes in dopamine and oxytocin. Sociologists analyze complex behavioral scripts dictated by historical eras and local geography. The brain kinematics model acts as a Rosetta Stone for these findings, demonstrating that these fields are observing the exact same underlying mechanism. Under this model, love functions as a measurable, multi-layered regulatory force. By treating love as a quantifiable gradient acting across biological and social networks, we can finally map the precise mechanics of human motivation. This coordinate plane maps an organism's cognitive, emotional, and physiological conditions into a single state space. We plot the individual's current reality as point E. The vertical axis represents E0, a theoretical state of perfect integration between the organism's physical body, internal meaning, and environment. Because current reality almost never aligns perfectly with the ideal, a measurable gap forms. We define this deviation as delta E. In practical terms, delta E represents raw systemic strain on the organism. To resolve this strain, the system generates a corrective force. This vector points directly toward the equilibrium axis. This specific negative gradient of strain, the active force of approach toward a state of coherence, provides the mechanical definition of love. The force itself is distinct from the destination. Love is the movement attempting to close the distance. If the distance between the current state and the ideal state reaches zero, the gradient vanishes. A continuous attractive force mathematically requires a persistent element of strain to exist. This expanded matrix represents human experience as a multidimensional tensor field, distributing variables across interacting subsystems. The off-diagonal terms encode coupling strength. This mathematical link explains why an emotional distance from a partner immediately triggers a measurable physical spike in heart rate. We can directly overlay established psychological frameworks onto these exact coordinates. John Bowlby's attachment theory observes the social-emotional quadrant. When Bowlby describes a secure attachment, he is observing a system that has successfully stabilized near the E0 axis. Object relations theory shifts focus to the cognitive matrix. The clinical drive to resolve internal fragmentation between the concepts of self and other is an identical gradient-seeking process. Mid-century humanistic psychology tracked this same force along the vector of identity. Abraham Maslow defined self-actualization as the individual striving to align their present actions with their most authentic, integrated cognitive state. Without a unified mathematical vocabulary, the prominent minds of 20th century psychology were documenting different quadrants of the same physical metric tensor. These abstract algorithms are executed by literal biological hardware inside the skull. We map the active gradient of approach directly onto the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Dopamine neurons fire most aggressively during the anticipation and pursuit of a goal. Once the reward is secured, the firing rate drops. To prevent the system from overcorrecting, oxytocin acts as a localized chemical damper.
Once proximity to the target is achieved, oxytocin suppresses stress hormones, minimizing internal entropy and holding the system stable near the balance axis. Carl Friston's predictive processing framework explains the cognitive purpose of this bonding. The brain operates by minimizing prediction errors. A beloved partner, idea, or deity functions as a low uncertainty anchor, reducing the energetic cost of processing the world. As Antonio Damasio established, this external predictability interlocks with the body's interoceptive network, forcing heart rate, respiration, and endocrine cycles into tight, coherent regulation. Yet, mammalian receptors are highly prone to habituation. Chemical saturation inevitably triggers a reduction in receptor sensitivity. As the dopamine system adapts, the biological equilibrium target coordinates shift, introducing a new margin of error and a renewed sense of distance. Because our neural architecture rapidly desensitizes to static rewards, the hardware ensures the organism remains in a continuous state of pursuit. This phase space graph maps how entire societies organize themselves around the unyielding friction of systemic strain. The modern Western model dominates the individual union quadrant. In this quadrant, the cultural script demands that the gradient be fully resolved, viewing love as fulfillment, partnership, and a cessation of distance. The Persian and Sufi traditions operate under a completely different set of variables. Recognizing arrival is impossible, Sufi mysticism prizes the purity of the approach itself. The beauty exists entirely in the endless, sustained momentum of seeking. The Bhakti traditions of India apply this exact principle to collective devotion. By emphasizing the physical separation from the beloved, the tradition maximizes internal strain, which actively intensifies the cognitive and emotional connection. Global cultures function as macro-scale algorithms, configuring social structures to either suppress or openly worship the unyielding tension of connection. We can observe the raw mechanics of this force by stripping away all external rewards, removing biological timing and formal recognition. A qualitative case study examines the recurring dream of an aging academic who repeatedly attempts to submit a doctoral application decades after his initial education. The dream constructs a high-friction attractor landscape. Surrounded by teenagers with perfect portfolios, the applicant carries handwritten, incomplete papers. The system is saturated with the massive delta E of inadequacy and exposure. To avoid systemic collapse, the sleeping brain executes stochastic gradient descent, searching the memory network for a stable configuration that can reinterpret this strain. The dreamer moves away from the admissions desk and begins to narrate his decades of interrupted attempts to a group of strangers in a cafe. This shift from competition to narration triggers a sudden integration. The dreamer realizes that the internal force returning him to the university, despite a lifetime of failure, is an act of pure love. In the terminology of the brain kinematics model, pure love manifests as a devotional, cognitive force. It identifies the persistent force of approach as the primary source of identity. While the target axis of formal recognition remains distant, the magnitude of the pull toward meaning is what constitutes the self. Across physics, neuroscience, and culture, love is defined by the dignity of how a system organizes its continuous, unbreakable movement toward meaning.